Hello, this is Argumentation, so what do you say we get right to it? Now, argumentation is our first written purpose, and at its most basic, argumentation is simply a process of reasoning. That's all it is. What it does is it asserts whether or not something is true or debatable. It takes a debatable position, belief, or a conclusion, and it takes a stand, and which is exactly what we do with arguments all the time. I'd like to borrow the car tonight. I'd like to borrow the car tonight because I'm 18 years old and I have a great driving record and I've always been a good little boy. May I borrow the car? This is an argument. The purpose of an argument is to urge people to share the writer's perspective and insights and point of view. Now, it can be very, very difficult not to understand what an argument is, but to tell it apart from something called persuasion. And persuasion is simply a generalized term. It just refers to the ways in which a writer might influence an audience to adopt a belief. Now, to persuade, you as the writer would rely on a variety of different kinds of appeals, and those three appeals are based on emotion, which is called pathos, or an appeal on logic, which is logos, or finally an appeal to the writer's reputation, the character reputation of that writer, which is ethos. Now, argumentation may use aspects of those, but it is primarily an appeal to reason. In an argument, you as the writer take a series of statements and you connect them together so that they can lead logically into a conclusion. I'm hoping that at this point you're understanding that argumentation is not difficult. We do it all the time. This is how you were taught to write an essay as a little kid. You were taught to write like this. It's not super difficult. What becomes difficult is adhering to certain tips and tricks in order to make sure your argument is as strong as possible and wrapping your heads around the terminology. And the terminology is one of those things in this purpose which is very important because it really helps you understand how to blend purposes, which is a tactic we're going to be dealing with later on. So when you are choosing how to present an argument, how to construct an argument, there are some things you need to work with. First, you have to decide purpose, and that's something we're going to spend a lot of time later on working on, but for now, let's just say there are many written purposes, and argumentation depends upon all of them. The next thing you need to do is you need to decide your scope. What are you seeking to argue? Who are you arguing with? And that kind of leads right into audience. For example, if you're arguing for or against abortion, you need to think about who your audience is. How likely are you to win? And that's what this is about. It's about persuading your audience. If your audience cannot be persuaded, you've chosen a poor topic. Now, the cornerstone, the absolute cornerstone to a solid argument is your thesis. Your thesis must take a stand. Things ought to be a certain way. Things ought not to be a certain way. It has to be something which is debatable. A good argumentative thesis takes a proposition that at least some people are going to object to give you room to argue. Several years ago, I presented persuasive writing, and I had the kids write an essay, and one kid, despite constant begging, please do not do this, wrote about how sexual assault ought to be punished. I'm hoping you can see the difficulty of arguing that. What person would argue against her? There's nothing to argue. She's right, just right out of the gate. There's such a thing as being too safe with argumentation. An easy way to try to figure out whether or not your topic or your scope is something that can be argued about is to flip it. Try something called an antithesis, which is a statement which asserts the opposite position. For example, the book has a couple of really, really great examples, and they're on page 550. And I'll just give one of them to you right now. It is, education is the best way to address the problem of increased drug use amongst teenagers. The antithesis of this would be, of course, education is not the best way to address the problem of increased drug use. It provides something to argue about. There are people who could say, no, not necessarily education. It could be family values, or it could be whatever's in Ecto Cooler. It could be anything. Now, the big difficulty with argumentation is what we're going to call a Rogerian argument. And a Rogerian argument is one that treats your opponent not as an opponent, but instead as a colleague. Now, there are some examples of this, and my favorite example is from a guy named Wayne Brockreed, and he died very recently. He was an early 20th century logician, phenomenally brilliant man, and if you ever take a college course devoted to argumentation, one of his texts will be a cornerstone. And he coined the term arguers as lovers. And the idea is not as corny as it sounds. The idea of arguers as lovers is simply that rather than approaching the person you're arguing with as somebody to defeat, and I say that sometimes, I say if you want to win, but it's not about winning, according to Brockreed. A successful argument is not about winning. It is about reaching compromise, treating your opponent not as an opponent, but as somebody you want to find a common ground with. And when we go back into toulmin thinking and you think about rebutting and all of those wonderful things, you think less about rebutting and more about maybe enveloping aspects of your opposition into your own argument and maybe adhering to some of those ideas as part of it. This all goes back to Phaedrus. Now, I'm sure you don't know who Phaedrus is, and that's okay. Phaedrus was a rhetorician, ancient Greek rhetorician, and he was the featured performer in one of Plato's dialogues. Plato was a philosopher who wrote a whole series of dialogues, which were essentially, he claimed, his teacher, Socrates, speaking to people. Now, the topic between Socrates and Phaedrus was love. They talked about what is love, what does it mean, what does it mean to love somebody, what are the different types of love, and what does it mean to show love. And as the topic went on, the two of them realized that they weren't talking about love, although they were really talking about the art of rhetoric, argumentation, and how it ought to be practiced. Switching back over to Wayne Brockreed, he is very famous for having noticed that many arguments are doomed to fail because of their focus on confrontation. If you go in swinging and you see your opponent as somebody you have to defeat, you're doomed to fail. You will never persuade them because too many bruised feelings, you end up destroying your own argument, your own emotions become a part of it, and you lose. The best way to do it, according to Brockreed, is to treat it as love. So now that we have an idea of what argumentation is in general, we can talk about the different types of reasoning. Now, there are 3 types of reasoning. We're only going to work with 2 because the third is really, really interesting, but for the sake of this class and for the sake of this purpose, we're not going to be dealing with it. The 2 we will be dealing with are deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Hopefully, these will be things that you're familiar with in one way or another, partly because you've been kind of trained in them, and partly because they're somewhat natural. Now, deductive reasoning is very, very specific, and it is very, very familiar to you, I hope. Deductive reasoning is when you go from the generalized to the specific. For example, birds are yummy. You know how I know birds are yummy? I know that birds are yummy because chicken is yummy. There's no new information in a deductive argument. It's just explaining your reasoning, and you do this all the time. Half of you I had as freshmen, and we wrote essays on the birds, we wrote essays on the cask of Amontillado, Romeo and Juliet, and it's not about walking the reader through the journey, it's just about kind of going back and saying, okay, I have this conclusion, and it's really general, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons as to why I believe that's true. Now, the difficulty with deductive reasoning, of course, is that it's very, very fallacious thinking. It's not authentic. And you can see this in the most popular and simple type of deductive reasoning, which we call the syllogism. Now, a syllogism has 3 major parts. The first major part is a major premise. It is a generalized statement. For example, going back, birds are yummy, or Romeo is a piece of garbage. We then go into a minor premise, which is related. It supports the major premise, but it's a specific example. From the major premise and the minor premise, we come to a conclusion. Based upon these pieces of information, when you take them together, something is true. For example, all Olympic runners are fast. That's my major premise. My minor premise to support it, well, Jesse Owens was an Olympic runner. My conclusion, of course, is that Jesse Owens was fast. It's logical, it's true, it is a perfectly sound argument. The difficulty comes when you start to introduce weird little fun things, and this is where it gets interesting. But I do want to point out that yes, this argument seems obvious, and that's part of the point. You can, based upon these two pieces of evidence, Jesse Owens is fast, Olympic runners, Jesse Owens was one of them, you can take them as true, and if you can take them as true, then therefore you can take the conclusion as true. You can't take them all as true. Deductive reasoning is it's a litmus of whether or not an argument is sound, not whether an argument is true. Let's try something else. All dogs are animals. There's my major premise. However, my cat is an animal. Therefore, my conclusion would have to be that my cat is a dog. Now, this is logically sound. It makes perfect sense. It is not true. This is the difficulty with deductive reasoning. So when we use something like this, we're not looking to prove our logic. We're looking to prove the soundness of our argument. And you can see a similar thing with the toulmin model, which is a really wonderful model for determining whether or not your argument is sound, but you have to use your own brain to determine whether or not something is true. The major premise has to be distributed, and what I mean by that is that something like all dogs are animals, okay, this is true, but it's something that only covers some of the items that it can define. Some things are also rocks. Some things are bugs. Some things are alien life forms on Pluto. It could be anything. A major premise has to be distributed. It has to cover all the items in the class that it denotes. Now, in this case, the major premise, dogs, is the distributive term. It designates all dogs. But the minor premise, that does not refer to dogs. That refers to animals. It's undistributed. It refers only to animals that are dogs. As the minor premise establishes, cats are animals, but so are dogs. Therefore, it's not necessarily true. Distribution, whether it's true or sound. Now, on the other hand, we have something called inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, I love. We're going to be using them a bit this term, and we're going to be using them a whole lot next term. Inductive reasoning is the idea of going from something specific to something big. Something specific, for example, chicken has been yummy. I have eaten chicken many, many times. My kid is 19 months old. He has eaten chicken at least once a week since he was 6 months old, and he loves it. You know what? He's also had turkey a few times. He loves it. To my mind and to my little kid's mind, I bet all your birds are yummy. New information is presented. Now, they're not necessarily logical conclusions, just like deductive reasoning, but new information is continuously presented. Think of it like this. It's when you pick up a breadcrumb, and then you look ahead of you and you see another breadcrumb. And then you look ahead of you and you see another breadcrumb. Based upon those breadcrumbs, you determine, I bet this is leading me somewhere. With inductive reasoning, you come up with something called a hypothesis. I'm sure you know what a hypothesis is in scientific terms. In these terms, what we're talking about is tentative thoughts, tentative questions, tentative answers to tentative questions. From this tentative idea, you then start to think it through. Why might this be true? One of my favorite inductive thoughts, kind of a little thought experiment we did in college. And what it is you open your eyes. You wake up in the morning, you open your eyes, and when you open your eyes start watering. You can barely keep them open. It just hurts. It hurts to open your eyes. Through the blurry vision of your tears, you look up and you see that your wallpaper is peeling. And you have this horrible cough. Which do you deal with first? Of course, you immediately think, well, which one is going to be the most physically painful? I think I'll deal with the cough first because that's the one that's stopping me from breathing. Meanwhile, as you're trying to puzzle through all these things, your house is burning down. What we did is we went through a hypothesis. We looked at our eyes, we looked at our cough, and we looked at our wallpaper, and we thought, what might be causing all three of these things to happen? Based upon these ideas, we make an inference, which is a logical leap. we provide our evidence, which is what those little pieces are. For example, chickens, birds, my eyes burning, whatever. Now, the inference, you've heard inferences before. This is childhood terminology for you guys. An inference is a logical leap. It's the conclusion that you make in the inductive argument, and it is vital to a true argument. That inductive leap is the difference between a fact and an argument. Or, to put it another way, a dictionary definition and a composition that's something to be proud of. Now, there are different types of logic, of course. There are valid leaps and there's invalid leaps. We see invalid leaps all the time. If you've ever watched CNN for any length of time, you can tell there are plenty of invalid leaps being done. Oh, this is happening because of this, and the terrorists will win. Well, no, that's stupid. Now, facts are verifiable statements, and this is the difficulty with a novice writer, is that it becomes difficult. And I'll be frank with you, I have made this mistake recently. Making the mistake of mistaking a fact for an inductive leap. A fact is a verifiable statement. If I open to page 37 in this book, this character will pull out a gun. This is something that happens. There's no arguing it. There's no point in really talking much about it. An inductive leap is an inference and an opinion that you make, which is not certain, but it is instead highly probable. Again, the limits of inductive reasoning. It doesn't necessarily prove much on its own. You need your own head for that. It's a litmus of structure. Does my argument make some sense? If it does, here we go. Let's take a look at this guy. This guy, I love this guy. I first saw this guy 10 years ago. No, not in person. I actually stole this from an argumentation professor. This guy is an interesting character, so let's try something. We're going to look at this guy, and we are going to try to make some inferences based on very specific pieces of evidence. We're not saying we're true. We're not saying we're right. All due respect to this man, I have no idea. I've never met him before. We're just making some guesses. Of course, you probably remember this guy. We looked at a picture of him when we did the toulmin model. We're looking at him again. This time, we're making an inductive argument. When I look at this guy, I see the piercings, sure. But the first thing I see, and this is a detail, when you look up there, he's wearing blue eyeshadow. That's an interesting detail. He is wearing blue eyeshadow. I look a little closer and I realize he's wearing lipstick. It's not just black lipstick. There's some red there. It's been very carefully applied. And I also look up and I realize he's got some something on his eyebrows, some sort of a makeup there as well. That's really interesting. If I look down in that lower left corner, I see pearls. Now, based on these very specific details, I'm going to make a guess. I'm going to make a guess as to why this is here. My guess, I think this is somebody who doesn't like norms in society. I think he doesn't like being told how you're supposed to dress, being told how you're supposed to act, and he is rebelling against that. He is providing a middle finger to anybody who would tell him, you must dress this way as a man. There are many ways to go with this. It's an inductive thought. Let's try this one. We've looked at this before. This is a little more fun. Redneck porta potty, I guess. There's a hole in the seat. All right, that's interesting. On the upper left there of the chair, we see the toilet paper roll, and it doesn't look like it's just resting there. It looks like something is put there, like somebody put a board there to hold it in or something. I'm also looking at it, and it's twisted in so that whoever's sitting on the toilet can very easily use the toilet paper. That's creepy. There's also a length of toilet paper kind of hanging off. Now, based on all of these little details, I'm going to make a guess. Whoever designed this chair has designed for comfort and nothing else. The person who made this chair cares about nothing more than comfort. When we think back to toulmin logic, this is what we're getting to. And if you go back to our previous bit, you can see our methodology from slide 12. Let's think about some responses to the student writer now. This is in your book. It begins in your book on page 567, and one thing I do really love about this textbook is that it provides student samples, which is really cool because they're annotated and they go over what everything is. It's kind of nice to look at when you're trying to figure out what's going on. And this one is all about this idea of something called the Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship. The Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship, as this guy points out, is $15,000 to a deserving student. However, Jennings was a racist, a horrible, disgusting racist, and this woman limited the scholarship to Caucasian students. This person is arguing, over the course of his essay, that no self-respecting human being should accept this $15,000. Now, the beautiful thing about this essay is that he goes through, in a toulmin model, his argument, and he provides deductive arguments and inductive arguments, as well as evidence to support, and he also refutes opposing arguments before he gets to his restatement of his thesis at the end. I highly encourage you to read this essay. There are some things to point out in there. First, because of his involvement with this subject, this writer could support his points with all sorts of different things, examples from his own experience. But he did go in to gather evidence. He reviewed the requirements for the scholarship to decide on the arguments that he would make. In addition, he reviewed an article that appeared in the school newspaper and the letters that students wrote in response to that article, and he chose material that would add authority to his own arguments. Now, when you're reading the essay, of course, statistics, studies, expert testimony, they would strengthen his argument, sure. But without this evidence, an argument such as his, based on reasoning, personal experience, and some research, can be just as compelling. You don't have to research something to death to make a solid argument. You just need to know what you're talking about. His documentation uses material from all sorts of different outside sources in his editorial. He uses information from a government website when he discusses the will. He also uses information from an article in his paper, as well as letters to the editor. He knew that newspapers editorials like this don't usually include documentation, so as he wrote, he used phrases like "according to one expert" to make sure the readers would know that he's using information from a source. This is acceptable in an editorial format. Generally speaking, you want to be a little more specific. When you're writing an actual essay, you don't want to say according to one source. You want to specify who that source is and point out the authority and the possible bias of that source. But for the sake of this editorial, that statement worked just fine. Now, he also added further documentation. Now, there are two sentences from this version of the editorial that you read with the proper documentation. The first one, I'm going to quote, "According to one expert, such challenges have been upheld by the courts. The striking down of a similar case in the will of an 18th century financier, Stephen Girard, is just one example," and he quotes St. John, page 12. Another great quote, one student said, "If we do not take that money and use our education to topple the barriers of prejudice, we're giving money to those who will use the money in the opposite fashion." Davakian. Perfectly acceptable. He also takes, again, some time to refute the opposing arguments. He begins by asking something called a rhetorical question. It's a question that's not asked to elicit an answer, but instead to further an argument. Now, the rhetorical question is a wonderful weapon to use, but it's not a weapon to use all the time, and it's one that the novice writer ends up starting every damn paper with, and it becomes quite infuriating. But you want to use it for punch sometimes. He asks a very specific question in order to further the argument, then he refutes what he considers the two best arguments against his thesis. The first is that students should take the money and work to fight racism, and then other scholarships at the school have restrictions as well. Matt counters these arguments by identifying a flaw in the logic of the first argument, and then by pointing to a fallacy, a hasty generalization that exists in the second. He also organizes his essay. He organizes it in that general form of a syllogism. Major premise, racism should be opposed. Minor premise, the Anna Todd Jennings Scholarship is racist. Finally, his conclusion, therefore, it should be opposed. He does this with a combination of inductive and deductive arguments. Now, when you're looking at building your essay, and while this is early in the book, it's something that I wanted to put at the end because it's something that needs the lip service, and it's something that is important. But it's also, I feel, cart before the horse. It's something that you should understand after you understand what an argument is. And that is, when you're looking for evidence, you need to look for the right kind of evidence. It has to be relevant evidence, it has to be representative evidence, and it has to be sufficient evidence. Now, when I say relevant, I mean it has to be actually pertinent to your argument. There are a lot of ways to think of this. There are plenty of things. Let's say you're doing an essay about HIV testing. There's plenty of evidence about HIV testing, sure. But if you're talking about whether or not there should be mandatory HIV testing for all healthcare workers, you're not going to have to spend a lot of time researching and providing a bunch of evidence about the history of HIV testing or the history of HIV and treatment options or anything like that. You're thinking about evidence that's pertinent to your argument, mandatory versus hypothetical HIV testing. You also need to make sure that your essay or that your evidence represents the full range of opinions about your subject, and this is difficult because we have a knee-jerk reaction to ignore evidence that we don't like or to kind of bypass stuff which doesn't necessarily help us. And this is something which becomes a lot more freeing when you write a larger essay. With a small essay, you have 2 or 3 points that you can make, and you have to go in and out so quickly you don't have the time to represent a full range of opinions. It should represent not just one side, not just the side that you're talking about. And again, this is where you think back to that Rogerian argument. You think, of the things that are not on your side, what can still be used? What can you accept as being true without losing your argument? For example, if you're arguing about not using animals in medical experimentation, you're not going to just go to the PETA website and use that. That would be a terrible idea. You want to actually use information supplied by medical researchers, pharmaceutical companies, perhaps medical ethicists in order to build your argument. Whether or not you agree with them or not is not relevant. It's about presenting the full range and accurate range of opinions about your subject. Finally, your evidence needs to be sufficient. Now, this depends upon the length of your paper, your audience, and your thesis. For something in the nature of 5 pages, that's roughly a 5-paragraph essay, you're thinking in terms of a few sources. You need to include enough facts, opinions, and examples to support your claims. The amount of evidence that you need, again, it depends on your length. If you're writing a 2-page paper, you need a lot less than a 10-page paper. An audience that is favorably disposed towards your thesis is going to only take 1 or 2 examples. For example, if you're arguing with me that comic books ought to be considered an art form, you're going to need an example tops, and I'm with you. But if you're going to be arguing that the death penalty should be abolished, you need to make sure you know your audience. And it depends on what your thesis is. Let's say you're arguing gun control. That is a very big thesis. You need a lot of evidence. But if you're arguing something specific, if you're arguing in favor or against the rights of gun control for people who have been convicted of spousal abuse, well, that's a whole different thing. You can choose your thesis to reflect the length of your paper, your audience, and how much evidence you need for that audience. If you want some examples on this, there is some stuff on page 552 of your textbook, and it is very useful stuff. Now, also in your book, I'm going to cover this very, very quickly. There is a section on transitions. It's on page 562. Transitions are, I'm hoping, things that you've seen before. For example, in transitions, you would use things like in conclusion, as a result, first, second, third, in summary, for example, for instance. These are hopefully very, very simple things. There is a really, really great tool in this book, and it's on page 43, and it's just a full list of examples of different transitions to use depending on the purpose that you're using. We also have how to structure an essay, and it's on 563 to 564. Introduction, body, conclusion. It can be useful. However, I'm going to be honest with you, many of you are probably at the point where you get it. You know how to structure an argumentative essay. You do it. You've been doing it. Miss Kemp made you do it. I made you do it. Everybody has made you do it since you were in 6th grade. Revision is also an important point, and there are a few different points to look at for revision. The first is on 564 and 565. There's a great checklist on there. A series of things to think about when you're deciding whether or not to revise your essay based upon peer review and things like that. First of all, did you choose a debatable thesis? Did you choose something you could argue about effectively? Do you care about what you're arguing about? That's a phenomenally important point. It's difficult to argue about something you don't care about. Have you made an effort to address your audience's possible objections? These are things to worry about. There's also editing, and based upon or built around editing, there are some checklists that exist not only on 565 but also on pages 71, 74, and 76. There's also some stuff about conjunctions on page 565 and 566. How to use coordinating conjunctions, and, but, or, nor, so, that sort of thing. It's some things that I am assuming you know, and it's some things that many of you do know, whether or not you know the names of it or not. And don't worry, I won't test you on the names of a subordinating conjunction or the parts of a complex sentence or anything like that. But I do expect you to know how to write proper. And then, of course, we have the student writing sample on page 567. Please look at it.